quitsmokingweed.com, the podcast on Spotify.
Older users often say it is not like the weed back in the day, and they are completely right. You know, you might be someone who hears people claim weed is harmless because they have smoked for years.
And you just quietly wonder why quitting feels so much harder for you than those old stories suggest.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I remember hearing those old reassurances myself and wondering why the reality felt so, disconnected from the myths. Today's cannabis is measurably and dramatically stronger.
It really is.
This single fact quietly rewrites all the assumptions people bring to quitting. So we are going to explore how cannabis potency multiplied over a single generation and why that makes dependence, anxiety, and withdrawal genuinely different now.
Well, when people talk about quitting, they usually focus entirely on their own willpower or, their personal mindset. We actually need to step back and look at the raw chemical reality of what people are consuming today compared to 20 or 30 years ago.
Because the baseline has completely moved, right?
Yes. We are looking at a fundamentally altered substance.
Oh.
The historical data paints a very clear picture of this shift.
What are the actual numbers we are looking at here?
Back in the 1990s, confiscated cannabis samples in the United States typically ran around 3 to 4% THC. By 2023, the average flower hits like 12 to 15%. And we see this mirrored in European and UK data as well, where Dutch coffee shop cannabis jumped to, 15 to 16%.
Oh, wow. That is a massive difference.
Yeah, and that is just the flower.
I mean, when you say it jumped from 3% to 15%, a lot of people might just assume farmers simply got better at growing it. They might think it is just like breeding sweeter strawberries or bigger tomatoes. I want to push back on the idea that this is just a natural agricultural evolution, though. Going from a 3% plant to a 15% plant feels like an engineered overhaul.
I would definitely agree with that. The transformation is the result of commercial selective breeding optimized for maximum THC simply because, it is the primary selling point. In both legal and illegal markets, potency drives the price tag.
So growers realized this and moved the plants indoors to play biochemical engineer.
Right. By bringing the plants inside, they eliminate natural stressors.
Because a plant in the wild has to expend a lot of energy surviving pests, wind, and unpredictable weather.
Yes. Indoors, they control the light spectrum, the humidity, the carbon dioxide levels, and the nutrient delivery down to the micro level. They push the plant to produce cannabinoid concentrations that outdoor cultivation could never achieve naturally.
The plant no longer has to expend energy on basic survival, so it just pours all of its biological resources into producing resin. And because the market dictates that higher THC sells for higher prices, every generation of cloning and breeding focus purely on that single metric.
They selected only the plants that produce the heaviest psychoactive payload. Then we introduced the exploding concentrate market, which takes this to an entirely different level. When you look at wax, shatter, and dabs, those products routinely hit like 60 to 80% THC.
Wait, really? 80%?
Yes, 80%. Chemical extraction strips away everything but the psychoactive compounds, creating an environment designed entirely around maximizing one specific chemical. So we are talking about a 3 to 5-fold jump in flower and a 10 to 20-fold jump in concentrates.
It is like someone who is used to drinking light beer suddenly switching exclusively to hard liquor. We would not expect their body to react the same way when they stop drinking, and we are looking at a completely different chemical category here.
Jumping from beer to liquor changes the physical toll on the body, yes. It also brings up what is lost in the process of creating these high-potency products.
Because it is not just about what is added, it is about what is missing.
That is the key. When you engineer a plant just to push the THC levels through the roof, the rest of the chemical profile changes. The crucial, often overlooked consequence of this optimization is the decline of CBD. As THC went up, CBD declined.
I want to pause on CBD for a second. People hear about it a lot, usually in the context of lotions or sleep drops you buy at a health store. But in the actual cannabis plant, what is its biological purpose?
Well, CBD acts as cannabis's own natural buffer against the anxiety-producing effects of THC. When THC enters the brain, it binds to specific receptors and creates a massive excitatory signal.
So it speeds everything up.
Yes, it's highly excitatory. But CBD physically alters the interaction at that receptor level in the brain, toning down the intensity of the THC. Lower CBD to THC ratios mean less natural moderation within the human nervous system.
Think about eating an apple versus drinking a can of soda. The apple has sugar, sure, but it has all this dietary fiber. The fiber is the CBD. It slows down digestion and stops you from crashing.
That is a very accurate way to look at it.
Modern weed is basically high fructose corn syrup. It is all spike and no breaks. You get the massive sugar spike without any of the biological breaks that the original plant provided.
The biological breaks are essential for how our nervous system handles the input. For predisposed individuals, this high THC and low CBD combination is associated with dose-dependent risks of anxiety and psychosis.
We are looking at an honest, mechanistic risk here, completely separate from fear-mongering.
Exactly. The reality is that removing the buffer changes how the brain processes the psychoactive elements. The brain is receiving a massive excitatory signal without the corresponding regulatory signal.
People often view cannabis as a monolithic entity, thinking weed is just weed. But consuming a product with a natural balance produces a fundamentally different physiological response than consuming an unbuffered product.
Because the endocannabinoid system in the human body is designed to maintain internal balance, regulating mood, appetite, and stress. When you introduce a 3% THC product with a decent amount of CBD, the system processes it relatively smoothly.
But when you introduce a 15% flower or an 80% concentrate with zero CBD, you overwhelm the system's capacity to maintain that balance.
The panic attacks, or the intense paranoia that some modern users experience, are a direct result of this missing buffer. The altered chemical profile of modern cannabis directly changes how the brain responds over the long term.
And that changes the whole conversation around addiction.
It really requires a complete reassessment of dependence. Higher potency raises the risk of dependence because stronger THC hits the reward system much harder.
Let us break down how that reward system gets hijacked. It is not just about feeling relaxed anymore.
Not at all. When a person consumes modern cannabis, the THC crosses the blood-brain barrier and binds to receptors that trigger the release of dopamine. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter responsible for teaching the brain what behaviors are critical for survival and therefore worth repeating.
And because the THC concentration is so high, it produces a stronger dopamine response than older cannabis ever could.
Yes, the brain registers it as a massive survival priority.
I have a direct question about that. Does the widely quoted statistic that only 9% of users become dependent still apply? You see that number thrown around in debates all the time. But if the reward signals are this much stronger now, that number feels completely obsolete.
That 9% figure likely severely understates the risk for regular users of today's high-potency products. Older research simply does not account for the modern potency era.
They were looking at a totally different substance.
Right. The studies that produce those numbers were looking at people consuming that 3 to 4% THC flower back in the 80s and 90s. They were not analyzing someone consuming 80% concentrates every day. The neurobiological impact of those two behaviors is entirely different.
We are still using safety data from the era of the horse and buggy to regulate modern sports cars. How does that stronger dopamine response translate into the daily habits of a modern user?
The brain adapts to the input it receives. When the input is a massive unbuffered dose of THC, the adaptation is equally extreme. It creates much stronger conditioned associations in the brain.
Like linking the habit to daily routines.
Yes, when the dopamine surge is intense, the brain links that massive reward to everything associated with the consumption. The environment, the time of day, the social circle, even the physical act of preparing the substance. These cues become powerful triggers.
The habit becomes deeply ingrained neurologically, not just psychologically. You are dealing with a brain that has physically rewired its reward hierarchy based on this modern potency.
Because the high-potency product provides such a profound chemical reward, the brain begins to prioritize it over natural sources of dopamine.
This physical rewiring brings us to the reality of withdrawal. Because the brain and body are adapting to a much heavier load of THC, the physical reality of stopping is entirely different from the stories older generations tell.
It is not just feeling a little grumpy for a few days. Withdrawal severity scales directly with how much THC the body has adapted to. Let us explain what that adaptation actually looks like inside the brain. What happens to the receptors when they are flooded with this much THC every single day?
They get completely overwhelmed.
Yes, they do. When you flood the system with high THC daily, the brain tries to protect itself from the overstimulation. It realizes there is way too much activity at the receptor sites, so it downregulates, reducing the number of its own natural cannabinoid receptors.
So it essentially hides them.
It pulls them back into the cell, out of reach, to protect the system from being constantly overwhelmed.
That sounds like a major structural shift.
It is a massive physical change. Regular use of high-THC products produces stronger physical dependence and much more pronounced withdrawal symptoms than lower-potency cannabis ever did.
I find it incredibly frustrating when older users say quitting is no big deal. They diminish the very real struggle of modern users based on outdated personal experiences. A person might feel weak or undisciplined because their intense withdrawal does not match their uncle's story about casually dropping his habit decades ago.
But they're comparing their experience to a completely different chemical reality.
Yes, those cross-generation comparisons predate the potency era, so those older reassurances simply do not transfer to modern users.
When a modern user stops consuming, their brain is left with a severe deficit.
Because the external supply is gone, but the receptors are still downregulated.
Right. The brain cannot produce enough of its own endocannabinoids to maintain balance, and there are not enough receptors available to receive the signals anyway.
This produces intense physical and psychological symptoms that older users rarely encountered. A person struggling to quit today is fighting a completely different biological battle. Their internal thermostat for stress and mood is broken.
We need to outline the honest timeline for quitting without sugarcoating it. People are constantly looking for a quick fix or a neat little window where everything magically gets better.
People need to know what to expect so they do not feel like they are failing when it gets tough.
We must actively correct the myth that the first few days are the most difficult. People assume that once the substance is out of their system, they are in the clear. But that is just the physical clearance.
The actual hardest stretch is the resilience phase in the middle.
The initial physical clearance happens early, but the psychological and neurological recalibration takes time. The THC leaves your bloodstream pretty quickly, but your brain has essentially boarded up its own dopamine windows.
It is trying to protect itself.
Yes, and it takes weeks for it to trust the environment enough to open those windows back up and let natural joy back in.
During that middle phase, the brain is struggling to balance mood, sleep, and stress without the massive external chemical input it has come to rely on. You might eat your favorite food or see your friends and feel absolutely nothing.
The brain is slowly rebuilding those downregulated receptors. The time frame we are looking at is around 7 weeks with proper support, up to about 3 months on your own. It is a slow, structural repair process within the nervous system.
Modern cannabis is not the cannabis the old reassurances were written for. It is a completely different chemical landscape. We are talking about engineered plants, stripped out natural buffers, overwhelming dopamine spikes, and severe receptor downregulation.
Consider how much of the struggle to quit is not a personal failure, but simply the brain acting exactly as it is biologically programmed to react when deprived of heavily concentrated, unbuffered THC.
The old reassurances are built on a ghost of a plant that barely exists anymore. What you are fighting today is an engineered chemical puzzle that your nervous system is actively trying to solve.
It is a biological reality, not a lack of willpower.
If you want to know where you actually stand, take the free self-check at quit-smoking-weed.com.